packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer JJ Bonella here with Drew Conry Murray, and today we have an all-news roundup for you from news from the past several weeks and stuff that we think is going to be making a difference in the coming probably weeks, months, years.
These things, they're news, but they sort of have a longer tail. So yeah, depending on when you're catching this, I think a lot of it is still going to matter.
Yeah. And just a reminder to you guys, well, it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. So happy October, everybody.
I wasn't aware that it was Cybersecurity Awareness Month. That's on me.
What? True.
I know. I feel like I've let the side down.
I feel like I've let you down by not making sure that you knew that. And I'm a little bit disappointed in both of us at this point. But no, yes, it is Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And also just a reminder to everybody listening, because I think on the summer, a lot of people were out doing other fun summery things. So those of you that are coming back into the fold, remember that you can always send us feedback at packetpushers.net/FU. If there's a burning topic, a question, some feedback, we would love to hear from you. And some of the things we're going to be talking about today in the news, NIST has new guidelines for password requirements. The White House has a new initiative for hiring. We're going to be talking about some of the other attacks on critical infrastructure, including telecom, the cranes at the ports, a pretty interesting hospital settlement after some naked photos of patients got leaked during a ransomware event, and then a municipal government that's getting its hand slapped for not following 101 level due diligence, I'll call it there. And then we do have one kind of critical flaw in HPE Aruba wireless architectures. We'll talk about that. So Drew, let's get started with the whole NIST updated the password requirements.
Yeah, and I think made some really interesting changes. I think one of the big takeaways is that they want longer passwords, but they're getting rid of sort of all these complexity rules that people had to do. Like you need one uppercase and one lowercase and 3 special characters, and one letter has to be blue.
Blue, I'm sorry, that just totally caught me off guard. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about in the security industry moving to passphrases instead of passwords for years. So a lot of us have been doing that. So probably some people are listening to this going, well, duh. But there are a lot of people, and I know because you guys like to harass me when I post certain things on Twitter and LinkedIn, that still kind of follow, the book of whatever NIST has published related to this. And so there's been this like misalignment because the guidance that gets updated more regularly already said use passphrases. Like we don't need all the complexity, it just needs to be long. And some of the NIST guidance, the link's in the show notes, but it's the 800-63-4, which is the NIST guidance for this.
I think the other thing that's interesting is that they are now moving away from those sort of mandatory password reset periods. Unless there's something that should trigger a password reset, you shouldn't be doing this sort of annual forcing everyone to change their password kind of approach, which I think is a good one. I like that one.
Heck yeah, it's a good one. Password resets. I mean, I think there's two sides of this coin, right? If you hear in the news that somebody got breached through a compromised password and the password had been floating around on the dark web and nobody had updated it for 8 years, that's a problem. We don't want to set the expectation the password never changes, but there should be some incident that's influencing that. And there should be, I mean, this is kind of like the tenet of zero trust, right? Where we're talking about taking in different feeds. So threat intel feeds, information from the dark web about compromised credentials. There's lots of services that offer that. So when something happens, then we might need to do a password reset. And there are several things that might need to trigger that, but you shouldn't be making people reset passwords every 90, 180 days, maybe not even once a year.
Yeah, and I think that's great because folks do get sort of like password replacement exhaustion, which does lead to bad or dangerous habits like simple passwords, very easy to guess, or just sort of whatever your password was, you increment it by 1. You put a number on the end and there you go. And that's not very helpful either.
Yeah, and the other thing I saw here is that they're forcing the providers to allow passwords up to 64 characters, which sounds, again, like a no-brainer, but there have been so many services. I had a bank, a real bank, where I had all of my money, not all of it, most of it at one point in time, that the password requirements would not let you use a password longer than 10 characters.
Wouldn't let you?
Wouldn't let you.
Huh.
And the only way to reset it was a smaller bank for obvious reasons. I stopped banking there. And the only way to reset it, it would force you to reset it every so often. If you missed that window, you had to kind of interact with somebody, and that always reset it to like the last four of your social or part of your phone number. It was something really
Oof.
stupid yeah, it was
Yeah,
not good.
that's bad.
And then I think the last thing I saw in there had to do with the security questions.
Right. It sounds like they are discouraging that notion of additional security questions as a sort of challenge mechanism.
Yeah, like I assume that's gonna be like the what is your dog's name, your mother's maiden name, where did you get married?
Yeah. Were you born? Whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stuff like that. Yeah.
So, the White House, one of the things we've been struggling with is that the federal government has been kind of the staunch stickler on having college degrees and other types of education credentials instead of skills based credentials. And now there's a new program that really eliminates a large percentage of that just to fill some jobs.
Yeah. The US White House has announced this new initiative. They're calling it Service for America. And the idea is to help fill, there's a number floating around that there are like 500,000 open cybersecurity jobs across the US. I've seen some other folks saying, I don't think that number is accurate. But anyway, there's lots of open jobs out there. And a potential barrier to folks filling those jobs are degree requirements. So this initiative is about maybe stepping back from unnecessary degree requirements and moving toward more a skill-based approach to attract candidates who might have the requisite skills or can go out and get the requisite skills. I'm assuming something like a certification, which is, I think, a lower barrier than going out and getting a four-year college degree for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, especially the cost of college. And, I don't hide this. I don't walk around waving the flag. I did not graduate from college. I went for a couple years in engineering with a double major in chemical engineering. And I had come out of the School of Science and Math and just decided to stop going to school. And I started working early.
Mhm.
And that worked out really well for me. I got very lucky and fortunate, but there have been so many jobs that because of the way the submission process works, you don't even get reviewed. Your resume doesn't even get seen.
Right.
And I think that's really unfair because, in this industry especially, and this is geared for cybersecurity, technology, and AI jobs. So it's really that whole ecosystem of tech. And we value curiosity, we value diverse thinking, we value all of the things that are not modeled after the strict college education to be taught, how to think about things.
Mhm. Honestly, JJ, I think your experience is fairly common in the cybersecurity industry. Lots of folks that I've talked to have come into their jobs through a non-traditional route. Like they didn't necessarily get a computer science degree or even go to college. They were good at computers, they liked them. They started a little business in the neighborhood and then suddenly found themselves starting a security company. So there is something about the cybersecurity industry that seems to welcome non-traditional folks. And I don't know if that's changed over time as the space has gotten more professionalized, but it does seem like the White House certainly is trying to remove artificial barriers that may be keeping qualified people or people who could become qualified out of jobs that do need to be filled. And I'm happy to see it.
Yeah. That along with maybe they'll stop saying things like entry level position and then they want 8 years of experience and some technology that's only existed for 3 years.
Right. This is an entry level position, and you need to be a Python expert and have managed firewalls for 6 years and also
Yeah.
have a PhD in astrophysics. Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. There's two sides to this problem. HR departments and people in charge of hiring also need to reset their expectations. The White House can't fix this problem by itself. There's lots of work that needs to be done here.
Yeah. I think on the commercial side, we've done a pretty good job. I also want to just make a call out. They are making some specific strides towards also hiring in for diversity. So bringing people from, non-traditional backgrounds, other work roles and career paths into tech and cybersecurity and paid internships. And they're spending a lot of money and thought on this. And I'm really glad because we need all the different kinds of people we can get here.
They're also putting some money behind it. The federal government is allocating 244 million for registered apprenticeships is what they're calling it. That's a variety of fields, but it includes cybersecurity. So that apprenticeship model also could, I think, be very valuable for getting folks into cybersec jobs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So moving on, we talk pretty regularly about sort of nation state actors and targeting critical infrastructure. So last month, the FBI and the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, released a joint statement to warn that Iran-based attackers are targeting critical infrastructure and government agencies, specifically with ransomware attacks. This isn't new. The FBI has been warning about the activities of this particular set of Iranian state-sponsored actors since 2017. But I guess now one of the new twists is these state-sponsored actors are coordinating with ransomware gangs, often acting as access brokers in exchange for a cut of the money. So the advisory is providing some details on reconnaissance techniques and access mechanisms so that entities in the target sector should know what to look out for.
Yeah, and this one, I feel like we've covered so many, I get them confused. Was this I was thinking there's one that we might be covering about the telecom.
This is different. Yeah.
Yes, because that was China. I was like, wait a second, this is Iran.
Right.
I don't know. They're coming at us from all sides now.
Yeah, for some reason, this group has attached the designation kitten to itself. There's other words and there's multiple groups. So there's one's Pioneer Kitten, there's other kitten ones. And I don't know who comes up with it, but Pioneer Kitten is,
Pioneer Kitten.
it's a very non-threatening name. And maybe that's part of their deception technique. I don't know, but
I don't know. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that when we post this on the socials, I am going to have Dolly and ChatGPT make a Pioneer Kitten hacker ransomware Iranian. I'm actually not going to tell it to make it Iranian.
yeah, you don't go there.
My Arabic reading and writing skills are horrible, so I don't know what it's going to like. Just looking at some of the stuff it does in English.
It's also probably going to come out really inappropriate. So,
Yeah, so we'll leave that part out.
yeah.
But I did want to call out, so this is one of the several happening right now, that the attacks are linked to several known exploited vulnerabilities in a lot of our outward facing platforms like firewalls and SSL VPN appliances and hitting critical infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, the report specifically calls out Checkpoint Software, Palo Alto Networks, and others that these nation state groups are going after these platforms that have known vulnerabilities. And they actually also list the CVEs. So if you are on one of these platforms, of course, patches or workarounds are probably your first good step if you are in one of these target groups. And you should be doing it anyway, but there's even more impetus.
Along the theme of critical infrastructure being attacked several weeks ago, there was an episode where we talked a couple times about the cranes, because the cargo cranes here in the US are made by a Chinese company to the tune of like 80%. And these aren't just the normal cranes you see over the skyline in a normal city. These are giant cargo cranes that are involved in moving 80% of the stuff coming in and out of our port.
Yeah.
Yeah. So big issue. Basically, short story was that the federal government put together a task force to look into this in a almost 1 year long probe, I think. And they finally released that report. And I did have to dig around to find the report, but we've got the link to that. So we'll put that in the show notes too.
Yeah, it was two committees in the US House of Representatives that put together this report. And essentially, the report is, quote, like raising concerns about cybersecurity and supply chain vulnerabilities. I think the fear here is that China could be gathering first information about US port operations. And second, if for some reason they wanted to, they could hamper these cranes functioning, which would then have repercussions for the broader US supply chain and the broader US economy.
Yeah. And we've seen what that looks like. Now, a few things that I haven't read the full report. I think it's like 50 pages. I started skimming that. I've tucked that away for some light weekend reading.
Oh,
But a
boy.
few things that stood out to me that were interesting. So, ZPMC. Now, just keep in mind that in China, there's not quite the separation of business and state like we have here. So,
Mhm.
a lot of these companies, the parent company of that company is very involved in the Communist Party. Like it's a tight family kind of thing. So, they're saying ZPMC, the company that made the cranes, is saying in April they denied responsibility for installing the cellular modems. So they're saying at first the story was, well, we need these for remote diagnostics and to support the contract. But apparently ZPMC was being pretty dogged about the ports accepting that remote access
Mhm.
as part of the contract. So some of the port authorities kind of caved into that and just said fine, because it sounded like they were threatening with, pricing and support if they didn't allow that. So then for them to come out in April and say they didn't install the cellular modems that were found on the cranes is now very interesting. I don't know if that's some or all of them. So there's quite a bit of confusion around that. There's also some involvement with some other companies outside of the US and outside of China. ABB, an automation company that I think probably a lot of us here are familiar with. They're a Swedish Swiss company.
Mhm.
So they manufacture parts and software for ZPMC cranes and other ones as well. Like they do all kinds of stuff. So
Mhm.
the US also appealed to them for supply chain purposes, I think, to try to get a handle on some of that. And they declined to participate in that. So the US is going to be spending quite a bit of money. I don't remember how much is tucked away, but many millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to replace these cranes with something that's made in the United States.
Or made in Germany, or made in Japan, or there's a couple of other big countries that are more aligned with the US interests that also make these cranes. Part of the issue is that China became so dominant in this particular industry because with that connection to the Chinese state, they were able to sell these cranes essentially at a loss or way, way, way cheaper than you would get from a Siemens or another large manufacturer. And that's one of the complaints that this committee report lays out, that the Chinese were essentially trying to undercut the market to control it. And then There's hints about dark, nefarious potentials. Nothing actually has been proven. And frankly, the report seems a little jingoistic to me. But I feel like we also saw this playbook with Huawei back when Huawei was a factor in the US networking market. They came in, they undercut, the traditional vendors, and the traditional vendors didn't like that and were able to sort of help get the government on their side by saying, security threats, security threats. Who knows what they're going to do with the software on these boxes and blah, blah, blah. And essentially drove Huawei out of the market. It feels like they're trying to play this game now with ZPMC in the crane industry here in the US.
I would say maybe a little twist on that, though, is we don't have US competitors in this space. In this case, right, I think ZPMC isn't taking anything out of the pocket of a competitor that's based in the US.
Right. One of the things I picked out of the report is that one of the recommendations of this joint committee is to take federal money and invest that into developing a US-based crane manufacturing sector. So there is that. But I take your point. There is no immediate direct US competitor that can point to harm here.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, not to be too naive, obviously, yes, if we do get into some kind of conflict with China, I assume they will take whatever steps they need cyber-wise to disrupt assets that they may have hooks into, and shutting down port operations would certainly affect the US economy and anything that we were trying to do, in some kind of conflict with China. So that's the thing. It's like there's a plausible story there. There's a high degree, I think, of FUD as well.
Maybe I'm just more paranoid, maybe coming from a military family. I don't know.
Could be.
Yeah, I don't think it's FUD. I think our biggest risk right now as Americans, just in the world, I don't mean cybersecurity professionals, but humans that are living in America, I think China is our biggest risk because they are not the people. So all of you, that are listening that are from China, I'm not talking about you, obviously, but the Chinese government, the Communist Party is a bully.
Yeah, absolutely.
They bully people. They bully companies. They bully their loyalists. They bully other countries. And their ethics and how they choose to operate are not in alignment with ours. So they're
True.
willing to do things. And I'm not going to say it's unethical. One of the things that, interestingly, the past couple of weeks ago, Kevin Johnson, actually, we had Kevin on the show back at the beginning, pen tester. One of the things he said is he doesn't like ethical hacking because everybody has ethics. They're just different.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is like that on a bigger scale, which is they have some ethics and morals, but they're not in alignment with our values here in America.
Sure.
So they're willing to do things that would be unthinkable for us to do to civilians. And I don't think disrupting port, transportation, government offices, even hospitals, healthcare, food, I don't think that is out of scope for them if they start something with, Taiwan and we try to intervene and they need to pull something out of their sleeve to make us stop. I think this is very, very viable.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that. And I 100% agree that I also want to separate out individual Chinese people from the Chinese government. The Chinese government, to my mind, is a dictatorship. It's definitely an adversary of the United States. And I wouldn't necessarily put anything past them. I'm also just trying to look at potential other motivations of the US government and committees and stuff about why this is happening.
It's definitely twisty. And I'm sure we don't even see the tip of the iceberg here. So there's all kinds of things happening.
We have limited access.
Limited access. Need to know. We don't need to know.
No, absolutely not. Moving on, JJ, you teased this story in the intro. Apparently, there's a Pennsylvania hospital group that is paying a very large fine to settle a lawsuit because there was a data breach and this hospital had naked photos of patients that got exposed.
Yeah. So it's not funny. This is not funny because the patients that were impacted. Now, the report from the hospital cites like 2,700 people. The lawsuit documentations later that the report summarizing it mentioned 600 patients involved in that. So we're talking about somewhere between, let's say, 600 and 3,000 people impacted that are cancer patients.
Oof.
Who had photos of them nude during treatment. What I thought was interesting first was that the person who initiated this, in regulated industries, there's like a compliance person, even if it's not I'm air quoting IT compliance person, so healthcare compliance. And that person notified one of the victims of this that had their photos leaked. Anonymously, the woman filed a lawsuit, and apparently at least some of these people weren't even aware that the photos had been taken. They didn't know these photos existed.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's a other layer here because the hospital administration is referring to these as like clinically appropriate and clinically necessary photos. I don't work in healthcare. I'd be curious to talk to somebody about what these are for, because it wasn't like, let me zoom in and take a picture of this possible skin cancer.
Right.
Right. They're identifiable photos of the whole person.
Jeez.
And they were leaked with their name. So you could actually search by name.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, if the hospital is taking photos without patient consent, that's bad. It's also extra scummy of the attacker to release this kind of information for money. That's
Yeah, it's Black Cat. So one of the ransomware groups there. The attack apparently came in and was within a network supporting one physician's practice in a county. So I'm curious to dig further into that and understand they get in there and pivot through, because I don't think the one practice would have thousands of photos of people. And anyway, that's something I think we've got to see more details. I didn't like the response from the hospital because they didn't, in the lawsuit, admit any wrongdoing.
Mhm.
I haven't seen any details about technically what happened here, but I hate to be judgy about what somebody has decided to do during a ransomware incident. The ransomware gang asked for $5 million in ransom.
Mhm.
Five, FIVE. They ended up paying 65 million in the settlement. So
Mhm.
you're talking about a factor of 10 to 12 times what they would have spent in the ransomware. And I think this could be argued a few different ways. We don't want people paying ransom because it encourages those actors to keep doing it.
More ransom. Yeah.
But when you're talking about something that's that personal and intimate, somebody who's vulnerable, somebody who's going through a very serious medical treatment protocol
Yeah.
and has photos of them in the nude that they may have not even known existed
Yep.
on the internet with their name, that is maybe a time to pay the freaking ransom.
Yeah, potentially. Although I could also argue that even if you pay the ransom, there's no guarantee that they won't leak it later anyway, or then come back and try to ransom you again for even more. So it's a hard decision. Yeah, you are dealing with a particularly sensitive class of patient, like nude photos of cancer patients. That's just what a position to be in. Yeah.
Not a good thing. And the other thing is, the $65 million, just, the scale here, ultimately the patients are paying for that, right? I mean, these 600 patients in the lawsuit got 80,000 each, but as a whole, now this organization has to make up $65 million.
Mhm.
Who knows? Maybe they have some insurance that'll cover parts of things, but it's unlikely if somebody was able to get in through, some physician's network attached to the practice. Probably some best practice vanilla 101, CIS control wasn't being followed. And most of the
Mhm.
insurance requires you to have your ducks in a row with that. But yeah, very heartbreaking, not a happy story there.
No, for sure. Moving on, but sort of in a similar vein, there's a couple of stories about some US counties who have been targeted by attackers. These are local and county governments, sort of small, maybe not well funded. They are just as much under threat as a big enterprise.
Yeah. And I saw Suffolk County, Long Island County. They're both New York. Okay.
But they're both New York, yeah.
Again, 20 years in working with municipals, city and county and state governments and all that. They're all over the place with their capabilities, but it sounds like Black Cat, so same ransomware group.
This is Black Cat, CAT, not Black Hat, just to be clear about that. Yeah.
Meow, meow, meow. Well, lots of cyber cats happening in the space. Now, I'm not a cat person.
That's true. Yeah. Kittens and cats. Maybe that's why.
I don't like them. But anyway, so Black Cat breached the clerks network, and then we're in there just chilling out, moving around, stealing files, putting tools in place, encrypting data. And it sounds like the FBI warned them and two of their security vendors, maybe it was Sophos and Palo Alto or something, two of their vendors and the FBI told them something weird is happening in your environment. And then they still didn't do anything, I believe.
Yeah, it sounds like Suffolk County in particular, they were using end of life firewalls. They hadn't patched vulnerabilities. And then, as you say, they got warnings and failed to heed those as well.
Yeah. So they're looking at something like $25 million in remediation costs at this point. Again, this is a public sector. It's the taxpayers that are going to be footing this bill one way or another. Money doesn't grow on trees.
Yep.
So they didn't have a CISO, which is not uncommon. They didn't know, like they didn't have any type of plan for responding to an attack or a breach or an incident. So, I think this just underscores the need to have some type of plan and understand and that probably if you don't have a CISO or someone who knows how to build and manage a program like this, there's plenty of third parties. We talked about tabletop exercises in an episode several weeks ago, Dungeons and Dragons, cool role-playing games for adults in the cybersecurity world.
Mm-hmm.
But some of the other stats out of that same report, 69% of state and local governments were hit by ransomware last year,
Mm-hmm.
which is an increase from the year before. So this isn't going to stop. I can tell you that, city and county governments are really hard. I know most people think you're a government, so you have all of the resources and help, and you just don't have that much going on because you're not Bank of America or whatever.
Right.
but it's hard because they have everything, right? They've got emergency services, they've got all of the community services, and sometimes they're doing utilities as well. Like it's a lot.
Yeah, it said the county's main website was unavailable for 5 months. 911 operations were temporarily disrupted. Residents couldn't do things like pay traffic tickets. So there are functions that your local and municipal governments perform that are necessary. They also probably hold some sensitive customer data, customer records. And of course, the reason that orgs like Black Cat are going after them is they're probably easy targets. Again, because as a government entity, they probably don't have a lot of funding. They've got a lot of other priorities. They're not in the cybersecurity business. They're probably working with older, outdated equipment. So it's probably easy pickings, which is why we're seeing the rise in ransomware against these targets.
I'm okay with not being able to log in and pay traffic tickets. Cool. Just get the pass on that for this year. But dude, your main website unavailable for 5 months.
Yeah.
That's not acceptable. 911 operations disrupted. That's not acceptable. That's just not okay. So, yeah, I think there's lessons to be learned here. And it's easy to play, what do they call it, Monday morning quarterback.
Yep.
But, this is back to just the basic 101. I'm going to go on a little bit of a rabbit trail. Can I do it?
Go for it.
Okay. Because just this very thing we were talking about. And so Drew and I are going to actually have a guest on the next week after you're listening to this, a psychologist with a PhD in psychology who has some specialization in cybersecurity for decades. Because one of the questions that came up in my mind at like 4 o'clock in the morning going to the gym was putting together 3 conversations that happened in quick succession around Drew and I talking about how nobody wants to do the basic stuff. And then my partner said something to the effect of, we were having a conversation with a friend, being technically minded, ADHD, and an engineer, that type of mindset of person, he was speaking about himself and a couple other people. They want to do the next shiny thing. They don't want to go back and revisit the old stuff and the mess and clean that up. And so I started wondering, like, what is there a psychology connection between some of this for us on the technical side? Anyway, so we thought that would be a fun conversation. So you'll get that in the next week or two.
Are we also going to discuss you getting up at 4 a.m. to go to the gym? That seems like a psychological issue.
I prefer to start my day early before all of the emails are coming in.
Well, you made me feel bad, but I'm impressed. That's great. No, and I'm just teasing. I think that's admirable. So
that's why I'm over here yawning at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
I also wanted a little bit of a rant. If you've heard me do this on Network Break, I apologize because we were discussing a different security story. But organizations do have a duty of care, particularly when they're dealing with sensitive data, and pretty much all data is now sensitive. But like a county government, they're not cybersecurity specialists. They shouldn't be expected to be cybersecurity specialists. Part of the issue is that we are dealing with IT vendors across the product spectrum who deliver buggy, badly written, poorly secured products that are hard to integrate, hard to make work together, very complex, particularly as you start adding security layers on top of it. It's just a mess. And that kind of bad product is not tolerated in other sectors, like in the food industry, in automotive, in aircraft design, in hospital products and stuff. But for some reason, it's tolerated in IT from the IT vendors. It seems like we're hitting a breaking point where the issue is less about, oh, they aren't doing the security basics, and more about they're trying to do an impossible task with crappy stuff. And we need to stop making crappy stuff.
I totally agree. Now, I don't agree that we're not necessarily doing the basic things right, but I totally agree that even when we do, we're screwed because
That's the thing. Even if you do all the basic things right, you can still get screwed because of some vulnerability that just popped up and you couldn't get to it.
Well, I think looking at it, we can give a lot of grace if somebody at least did the minimum required things. They were doing the right things. And then this other thing happened. I will give grace to that because, the vendors suck.
Mm-hmm.
And it's why I started the CISO launch program that's going to be starting next year, which is basically taking IT leaders who are operating in an organization without a CISO, and they need to make cybersecurity informed IT decisions related to projects and budget and personnel, but they have to keep doing the IT stuff as their primary jobs, like figuring out how to deduplicate those efforts, how to streamline, how to kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone with that, and get them focused on those things that matter. Because a lot of times it feels like with all the vendors coming at us, we need to do 50 million things. The truth is there really just might need to be a handful, a dozen or two that would really be impactful in the organization, but people don't know where to start. They need structure.
Right. And a lot of it is kind of boring and tedious and a grind, but it needs to be done. And yeah.
Yep. Speaking of grind, more China.
Yeah, so according to a report in the Wall Street Journal, a threat actor with ties to China's government has broken into the networks of multiple US broadband providers. This group, known as Salt Typhoon, may have access systems used for things like court-authorized wiretaps. The breach companies include Verizon, AT&T, and Lumen/CenturyLink.
Yep. Where do they come up with these names? We've got Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon. There was some other typhoon. I want to talk to somebody who names these things. One of the things I did see, so I think some of the reporters were able to talk to Verizon, who was a little more forthcoming with information than AT&T and Lumen. In the Verizon environment, they were able to exfiltrate data by reconfiguring the Cisco routers.
Oof.
Mhm.
Wow. Geez, they had that level of access. That's frightening.
Yeah. And so we don't know, are they just that sophisticated and secret squirrel, or did Verizon not have their alerting? I'm not speculating. I have absolutely no clue about that, but I guess we'll see.
And it's interesting they went after the wiretapping surveillance system. According to Ars Technica, one speculation is that they were looking to find out about American surveillance against Chinese targets. So I guess they were like, well, that's where it would be. So let's go check out that data source.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. There's definite ties to Beijing, but like everything else, it's funny because China's like the kid that just refuses to admit to doing whatever thing they did. You know what I mean? Like, no, I didn't do it.
Wasn't me.
Yeah, they point at somebody else, or it's kind of crazy because all of the things where we have this proof of China doing questionable, shady things, Chinese government, they turn it around on us and just say we're either being paranoid or we're picking on them, or, there's no way this is actually happening and it's not backed by the government. But certainly, an intel collection campaign happened here. And I mean, Verizon, AT&T, and CenturyLink and Lumen are not poorly resourced organizations, and they are where a lot of our traffic goes through and to.
Yes, it's not Suffolk County. AT&T is
Yeah.
not Suffolk County.
Yeah. So the FBI and all of the various intel agencies, along with Homeland Security, are looking into this, and I'm sure we'll be talking about it again in the future.
Our last story for the day, Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, they're releasing fixes to address 3 CVEs that affect HPE Aruba access points running the AOS 8 and AOS 10 operating systems. All 3 vulnerabilities are critical command injection issues, so these are probably fixes you want to apply ASAP.
Yeah. So the PAPI protocol is an Aruba thing that they use to communicate between the APs and like controller infrastructure, and probably other things like between APs and between controllers and controller coordinators and stuff. So this is kind of a big deal because most organizations have some of this exposed either publicly to the internet because they have remote APs or they've got remote sites that are tunneling back in. And most often, speaking from a little bit of assessment experience there, very often when those things are in the DMZ or outward facing, they're not protected and hardened perfectly, right? There's always just something not done perfectly there. And if it's your wireless infrastructure and you're in an organization where parts of your physical space are accessible by the public, somebody sitting out in the parking lot, for example, or coming into a common area, a lobby or public venue, whatever it is, this isn't one of those situations where, oh, nobody can access this, I think is the point I'm trying to make. And this is so they're like 9 point something, high 9s, almost 10s, because it is a remote code execution and critical command injection. So definitely something to patch. And, Aruba 8 and 10 are the current versions.
Yep. And we'll have links in the show notes if you need to go jump on that.
Yeah, and one thing I feel like I should know and I don't, having implemented many an Aruba network over the years, I can't remember if you can use something other than PAPI. I don't remember if it does CapWAP or other like IPsec tunnels for that. There might be other options. This PAPI thing is a proprietary protocol, which I'm just not a fan of proprietary protocols. I'd rather use something standard that has been already beaten to death and patched to death.
Yes, for sure. Well, if you know, you can always hit us up at packetpushers.net/FU. The FU is for follow-up. We always do love to get feedback, whether it's an update, an insight, a correction, or just a hello. That does wrap up this episode. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If you have a topic you want us to cover, you can find us on LinkedIn or also at packetpushers.net/community with the free Slack channel with other IT and security pros. As always, we appreciate when listeners reach out, and stay safe out there.